Hello. Today I am presenting the work of the sociologist Arlie Hochschild, and what I think is most fascinating about her work is that she's given a vocabulary to many of the things that are quite contemporary, in the sense that I'm sure you'll relate to many of the processes and phenomena that she speaks about. Also, I want to remind you that I spoke about Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique in our previous lecture, and she writes about the problem that has no name. So, in one way, Arlie Hochschild, as a feminist sociologist, gives a name to several of the sociological processes that appear quite personal in her work. She is quite a prolific writer and has written more than 10 books. I've only put up a few here, and then the ones that are in bold are the ones that I will speak about today, which also is a lot. So what you'll get in today's lecture is snippets from these works, and also it will give you an understanding of one way of looking at labor, a way of looking at labor which Marx did not anticipate, a way of looking at discipline which Foucault did not write about, and a way of looking at care which even feminist scholars did not elaborate on. So let's dive deep into Arlie Hochschild's work. One of her first books in 1974, titled The Question Girl, was a children's book, in fact, when her own child was much younger and her daughter was much younger, and she wrote a book and published it about a girl who asks a lot of questions. And I like to mention such things because, remember in my lecture on Partha Chatterjee, I want to also show you that this whole notion of specialization, this whole idea that restricts our intellectual and creative energy, is not something that has always been the case. This is very particular process in the capitalist economy. And so it's important to also look at what are the various other creative potential that scholars have explored and that we can explore in our own work. Alright, so I'll speak today about her work on the managed heart. Primarily my lecture is on that book of hers, published in 1983, and then very briefly I'll touch upon the notion of second shift, time bind, and the outsourced self. We usually take the idea of the terms second shift as quite normal now. It's reached our everyday vocabulary, but Arlie Hochschild is the scholar who gave that work. She's a professor emeritus at University of California in Berkeley and has been there for a long time, received her PhD from there, and then continued to teach there, and also continues now to remain associated. Her more recent work is also quite fascinating, which we're not touching upon in this lecture, and looks at the emotional world of the right, is looking at what happens or what is the ongoing processes under the Trump leadership in the United States. So what is her central question? Arlie Hochschild, I think if I had to kind of sum up her life's work, then it goes in answering the question, in what ways does capitalism reach into our most intimate of lives and how does it influence our emotion? And she's largely known as a scholar of emotional labor. You would think that her work in many ways derives from and builds upon the works of C. Wright Mills, in that she takes something that is most private to us. We feel that our emotions are our own, our feelings are our own, but she shows us, using Wright Mills' provocation, that our private lives are very much part of the social world. That's largely the insight that she has. She also draws heavily upon the work of Erving Goffman, and in the strain that is often within sociology referred to as symbolic interactionism, where he wrote about how we perform our emotions or our social lives, and he draws a lot on the idea of theater. In fact, he terms this process of performance as dramatology or dramaturgy, drawing upon the Latin word persona, the word person coming with the sense that there is a mask that separates us from the other, and we put on these masks based on our context, very clearly linking our private life to our public life. Alright, so Arlie Hochschild defines emotional labor and argues quite strongly that even though emotions appear as deeply personal and intimate and our own, but they are also profoundly social in nature. Again, take Goffman's idea that we perform our emotions, that we act our emotions or our feelings in different contexts, and that these are sometimes considered appropriate or not appropriate. We judge other people's emotions. So in that sense, they are indeed quite social. She defines emotional labor as the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display. Emotional labor, she reminds us, is sold for a wage and therefore has exchange value. So Hochschild did extensive studies, especially in the service professions, such as studying flight attendants, such as studying bill collectors, and she interviewed several flight attendants. She also observed them, and she observed their training sessions where they were instructed to smile and keep the smile on their face at all times, to appear helpful, forthcoming, to calm down the fears and anxieties of their travelers, to appear in a certain way such that the passengers coming in feel welcome. You would have noticed that, right? If you flown in a flight, of how the flight attendants are supposed to appear always thrilled to welcome you on board. This is part of their training. They are selling a particular emotion in their work, even though it is not recognized as such. This is where, in fact, I would say Hochschild really contributes to an understanding of labor. Even Marx and Marxist scholars basically saw labor as either physical labor in the factory or as mental labor. But the idea of emotional labor, as many of these professions require emotions, and emotions generate profit for airline companies. Many airline companies sell the idea that, or many hospitality industries in fact sell the idea that we are there to welcome you, please come, and how that manifests is through the emotional world, through the bodily gestures, through the facial expressions of the employees in that industry. The emotional labor requires one to induce or suppress feeling in order to sustain the outward continence that produces the proper state of mind in others, that others feel welcomed, that others feel safe, that can appease others' frustration, anxiety, fear, anger, all of that. Women do it all the time, even within families where they act as managing family conflicts, or in care work. This emotional work happens a lot, but it also, as Hochschild shows us, is there for sale in the capitalist market. Now think about the receptionist sitting at a hotel counter. I also mentioned that she studied bill collectors who are supposed to feel, supposed to show their anger or strength in order to create the feeling of fear in those that haven't paid their bills in a timely manner. This work, she says, is a distinctly patterned, yet this whole thing works within a distinctly patterned yet invisible emotional system. So this invisible emotional system, she calls them feeling rules. So they are rules. They're sometimes implicit rules, usually within, let's say, a family or in the private sphere, that women are supposed to behave like that. They will always be caring and friendly and make you feel welcoming, the angel in the house. And in the workplace, these are prescribed. These are like the air hostess example that I gave following Hochschild. Smile, smile is what they are asked to do. regardless of how they are feeling internally. They might be overwhelmed, they might be tired, they themselves might be anxious about the upcoming long flight. There might have been incidents that had happened at home that might be impacting their inner emotional worlds, yet what appears is the smile, right? So think about this aspect of emotional labor as it plays out in the market economy. What does that do? In order to show us what that does, she wants to first take us to what do emotions do for us, right? So she writes in The Managed Heart, emotion functions as a messenger from the self, an agent that gives us an instant report on the connection between what we are seeing and what we had expected to see, and tells us what we feel ready to do about it. Emotions signal the secret hopes, fears, and expectations with which we actively greet any news, any occurrence, right? So emotions are a reflection, or are meant to be a reflection of our inner world. They are our intuitive sense, they are our moral compass, they are our points of connection, right? So they are, in that sense, quite intricately connected to our sense of the self. Yet, she writes, and I'll explain, although I'm reading out this quote here, I'll explain what she means by deep acting in my next slide. She says, when deep acting is done in a private context, it is called emotional work. When it is done for a wage, it becomes emotional labor. So, like I said, even within families, men and women are constantly doing emotional work. Primarily, a lot of it falls on the shoulders of women, but also men do it. They're supposed to be the providers, they're supposed to bring in the wage. Sometimes the father figure has to act as a patriarch. So all of these are the way one expresses one's emotion, and it is work. It requires a conscious effort in order to do. Now, in portraying certain emotions, but not necessarily the ones that come authentically to oneself, one tends to become alienated from oneself, right? Because we are not doing what emotions were meant to do as a messenger of the self. They are in fact a messenger of what we want the self to appear as. So the worker, she writes, can become estranged from an aspect of self, either the body or the margin of soul that is used to do the work. And within the capitalist economy, the emotional system of the worker becomes a resource to be managed. Employees are trained to manage their emotions, how to behave, what to express, how to appear, and these show up in many different ways. And she tells emotional labor can happen in two different ways. One she refers to as surface acting. Now, surface acting is a management of the outward expression. This is the flight attendant smiling as you enter the aircraft, even as her inner feeling is one of tiredness or anxiety. So it shows in facial expressions, in the tone of one's voice, in bodily gestures. These are the ways through surface acting one performs emotional labor. In these contexts, the inner feeling, whatever we are feeling internally, does not need to or does not match with the outer display. Like you might be very angry with somebody in your neighborhood or at your boss, but what you're showing is a restraint, what you're showing is a more docile demeanor. So what this does is it causes an emotional dissonance. What you're feeling is not the same as what you are expressing. But she says in this form, the self is still protected because you are acting, you know that you're acting, and you know what you're feeling internally. So you're not deceiving yourself on that front. However, in deep acting, which many times also the employer asks the employee to do, in the sense, feel the emotion, like in care work, so that it appears authentic, right? So a nurse, for example, should not just appear to care for the patients, but also authentically, genuinely feel and care for the patient, right? And are instructed to do so. You kind of internalize certain feelings and emotions, you induce certain feelings in yourself, and you induce certain feelings in yourself by either suppressing your own actual feeling, by reshaping it, such as thinking, oh, this is an elderly patient and this could have been my mother or father, and invoking in yourself a certain feeling which then appears in the form of an outward expression. And you can do it by reshaping your thought. You can bring certain images or bring certain memories to the table that will influence how you feel inside, and that inside feeling then is what is also outwardly expressed. So this she refers to as deep acting. And she says this is actually probably more damaging because you start to believe that these are your true feelings, and therefore you even more lose touch with yourself, because now you don't even know that you are acting. You become so conditioned, it becomes so automated that authentic feeling or authentic emotion actually does not find a place in your everyday way you act or the way you behave or the way you are. She says in surface acting, we deceive others about what we feel, but we do not deceive ourselves. In deep acting, we deceive ourselves as well, and therefore it alienates us much more than what surface acting does. Here again, she is building upon Marx's insight of alienation by bringing in what emotional labor does to the performance of labor. She actually, in fact, in the book gives the two examples. She juxtaposes two examples. One is of young factory boy whose mother carries him to work, and he has to do a certain task with his hand, but it's otherwise kind of, his mother feeds him, she kneels down to feed him. So she asks questions like, so is his arm that is doing the work, whereas otherwise he's imagining something else, his mother is feeding him alongside, is doing something else. So that arm, is it, can we even say that his arm is his own for the time that he's doing factory work? She says this physical work appears to be labor, but it's not very different from the emotional labor that is performed by the flight attendant, that is performed by the bill collector, that is performed by the staff nurse, that is performed by the teacher. Even though that emotional labor appears invisible, that emotional labor, because largely also of its gendered connotations, women are supposed to be naturally caring, naturally loving, a lot of the emotional labor that is performed appears invisible. It is, behind naturalized, normalized ways of being. Let's move on to her other work. I will very briefly, like I said, touch upon some of her other work. Largely not so much, I would say, because I'm going to build upon or articulate her whole theoretical perspectives here. That, I think, what she does for emotional labor is her prime contribution. But also, like I said, she helps us see things that might otherwise appear as things that have no name, by articulating them, by giving us a theoretical vocabulary to understand them, not just as private troubles, but as public sociological processes. In this book titled The Second Shift, she actually went and interviewed several married couples. She says, I think, married couples with young children below 6 years old. And she was driven to do this work because she was trying to see that, she says, my mother was born in the early 1900s. At that time, life was very different. Women didn't have the right to vote. It was very hard for them to find meaningful work outside the home. There were only a few professions, such as the caregiver or the domestic servant, the teacher or the secretary, receptionist, that were open to them. And so their life worlds were in some ways limited. And then she says, we move on to my times, where a large part of the American working population is also women. And she says there is a lot of sense of freedom in terms of work for women now. And one might think that women would be happier, more contented, lead more satisfied lives, but that is not the case. And this drives her to do this research And then by interviewing several households, she notices and coins the term second shift, is that while women have been enabled and encouraged to go outside and work, but the sexual division of labor in terms of household work has not changed. That still remains the same. After observing that while marriage appears as an intimate social relation, as something more personal, if there is a divorce, often the couple feel that they individually have failed. But she writes that each marriage bears the footprint of economic and cultural trends which originate far outside marriage. Here again, you would be reminded of Mills. She says, the real work of marriage often lies in maintaining a sense of connection, emotional labor. Women tend to do more of the emotional work of noticing, responding, and soothing over. Behind the statistics of who does what lies a more elusive reality. Who worries, who plans, who anticipates, right? So these are when she's doing her interviews, she's also drawing out negotiations that happen within households. What do couples consider as a fair division of labor? How do they manage gendered expectations? Based on this empirical study, she says what has happened is that, she says, it's been a stalled revolution. So while some aspects of the gendered ideologies of the sexual division of labor have been altered such that women can now go to work, that revolution has stalled and it hasn't made a broader shift in our understanding of gender in the larger society. And she says the problem is not just individual men or women, but a social system that asks for equality at work and traditionalism at home. So this disjuncture created this burden of the second shift, where the woman goes outside and works her 8-hour day, but then she comes back to tend to children, to cook the family meal, to put things in order, to keep time for everyone else in the family, to manage household works and all of that, including engagements with other families. So this, many women that she interviewed felt the idea of the second shift that she puts across. I want to re-emphasize the idea that it is not a private trouble, it is sociological shift in the way we understand, labor, in what we value, in what kind of structures we create. Remember our previous lecture on the kind of social structures and the kind of built structures that can enable a more fulfilled, satisfactory life for all, including genders, including class, including caste, including race, and other social identities. In her next book, The Time Bind, when work becomes home and home becomes work. While she's writing this before the COVID pandemic, I think after the COVID pandemic, many of us have noticed this, blurring of boundaries, work never ceasing to end, finding time for leisure becoming a very, very difficult task. But she's writing much before that in the American context, and she says, our homes are invaded by the time pressures of work, while the workplace has become a surrogate home. So this work she basically builds upon after an empirical study that both men and women are spending more and more time at work and less time at home. What Nancy Fraser has called the crisis of care emerges because social reproduction is an essential part of, it's integral to capitalism, right? So without it, how do you even sustain? She says also creating a kind of detachment then from home, because the less time you spend at home, it appears as one more thing to go to, one more task to do. And then work at home is largely isolating and therefore does not carry with it the kind of social appreciation, the friendships, the sense of togetherness that being in a workplace does. She writes, the workplace offers what the home no longer reliably provides: appreciation, a sense of accomplishment and control over time. Notions of what is valued are quite integral here. She says time-bound strategies are often justified as personal preferences rather than structural necessities. Yet most people don't have the sociological imagination in order to see that. Most of them think of this as their choice, as I choose to work more, I choose to put in much more effort in my work. But how structurally these kind of shifts are being encouraged or being put in place is what most people fail to see. She says people describe their schedules as choices, even when those choices are severely constrained. The time bind is not simply a personal dilemma, it is a social problem with emotional consequences. Let's move on to her next work titled The Outsourced Self. What happens when we pay others to live our lives for us? Again, this is something I think that especially in India where labor is very, very inexpensive and cheap, we are used to outsourcing a large part of our work, especially middle class and upper class families, to domestic work. Usually you would have, again gendered, but domestic women help coming in to do our dishes for us, to cleaning our homes for us, to caring for our children, to caring for the elderly, all of that. So it's become so normalized that she's writing, pressed for time, many families turn to the market not as a last resort, but as the normal solution. It's normal. Nobody even questions that, that this is the way to be. And not just care work. She says, we are increasingly turning to experts to tell us how to feel, how to relate, and how to manage our inner lives. The plethora of self-help books, let's say, kind of, they tell an apt story to illustrate this point. Now, the thing is that this outsourced self is shaped by markets that promise relief from emotional strain. So you are, one, because of the emotional labor, because of the time bind, all of that, you're so detached from your inner self that how you are being shaped is now being dictated by the market rather than an internal intuition or internal moral values. Here I am also reminded of Weber when he talks about how the cloak was supposed to fall lightly, the Protestant ethic, on your shoulders, but has now become the iron cage that traps us. And this outsourcing of work that we do, she says, does not erase inequality. It really does not change anything in a transformative manner for a more egalitarian society. It in fact rearranges it. Care work travels down the social ladder. The Global Bind, this is another book of hers, so the last sentences from that book where she speaks about how oftentimes the relationship globally between the global north and the global south is that people from the global south go to the global north to perform care work. Often cited example is that of Filipina nurses going to Canada to work as nannies, even as their own children back home are left to fend for themselves or outsourced to more of their own domestic extended relations. Again, a very important concept. Towards the end, I want to end with this quote from her Outsourced Self, which I think summarizes a lot of Arlie Hochschild's work. She writes, the market has crept into the very heart of our emotional lives. What we once did for love, obligation, or moral commitment, we now increasingly do for pay or purchase from others. The question is not whether we have emotions, but how economic and social arrangements shape what we feel, how we feel, and for whom. So I'll end this class here. See you in the next class. Thank you.